This grain was never dangerous. It never harmed the people who depended on it. For most of human history, it simply did what food was meant to do. It nourished quietly and reliably. And then, in a surprisingly short moment of time, it was left behind. Not because it failed, not because it became less nourishing, but because the world began to move faster than it ever had before. Fields were asked to keep pace with machines. Harvests were expected to arrive on schedule, not in their own time. Sameness became efficiency. Speed became success. Some plants adapted. Others did not resist, but they did not rush either. They continued to grow slowly, unevenly, according to the rhythms of soil, rain, and season. In a world learning to measure everything, that kind of patience no longer fit. So the grain did not disappear in catastrophe. It faded quietly, outpaced by convenience, replaced without ceremony. Bread remained. Fields stayed green. Shelves stayed full. Yet something subtle had shifted. A rhythm the human body once knew no longer part of the daily meal. That rhythm once shaped entire lives. Long before years were counted, before borders or recipes were written down, people lived by what the ground allowed. They learned the seasons with their hands. They pressed soil between their fingers, breathed in its dampness, and waited. Food was not selected from abundance. It arrived when the land was ready. In those early settlements, when villages were just beginning to hold together, there was a grain already waiting in the fields. It wore a tight husk, as if protecting itself from haste. It ripened unevenly under skies that did not promise certainty. Its harvest was modest, but it returned year after year, even when the soil was poor and the rain uncertain. Families learned to live with it. A portion was set aside each season, not to trade, but to endure winter. The grain was threshed, slowly stored in cool darkness, ground only as it was needed. When it became bread, the loaf was dense and warm, carrying the smell of straw and hearth. It filled the body without heaviness. People did not speak of digestion, yet they noticed how they felt steady, able to work, able to rest. There are old stories of travelers crossing long distances with little more than this grain in their pack. It survived poor roads and colder nights. In some places, it was the difference between lasting through a hard season or not. No one called it ancient then. It was simply what grew. Much later, scholars would give it a name, Einkorn. But back then, it did not need one. It was the wheat people trusted, the kind that followed the pace of rain and time rather than demand. That quiet partnership would last for thousands of seasons until the world around the fields began to change and patience itself started to feel like a liability. As the world around the fields changed, the grain itself did not. What changed was the pace of life beyond the soil. Villages grew into towns. Hands gave way to tools and tools to machines. Farming began to answer not to seasons but to schedules. Machines required predictability. Fields were expected to ripen all at once. Stalks needed to stand at the same height, mature at the same moment, and yield the same result every year. Uniformity became efficiency. Efficiency became survival for the system. The old grain did not resist these changes. It simply could not follow them. Its stalks grew unevenly. Some ripened early, others late. Its husk held tight, protecting the seed, but slowing the work of processing. To people who worked patiently, this had never been a flaw. To machines built for speed, it was. Convenience reshaped the field. Grains that threshed easily replaced those that asked for time. Varieties that responded quickly to fertilizer outpaced those adapted to poor soil and long memory. Nothing was outlawed. Nothing was condemned. Choices were made quietly, season by season. The new system solved real problems. It fed growing populations. It reduced labor. It delivered abundance on demand. But it also asked something in return. Fields became more alike. Harvests became synchronized, and the relationship between food and the body began to change almost without notice. Machines thrive on sameness. The human body never has. What once adapted to people now asked people to adapt to it. And many did without complaint, without language for the change they felt. By the time discomfort appeared at the table, the shift had already taken root in the fields. The grain had not failed. It simply no longer fit a world that had decided waiting was inefficient. Only much later did science begin to notice what people had felt all along. Not with alarm, not with headlines, but with careful observation. Researchers looking back at older grains found something unremarkable at first glance: simpler structures, fewer layers of complexity proteins arranged in ways the body seemed to recognize more easily. Nothing miraculous, nothing engineered to impress. It was the difference between a long conversation and a rushed instruction. In everyday terms, many people describe it without scientific language. They speak of bread that feels lighter, not because it fills less, but because it settles quietly. Of meals that satisfy without leaving the body tense or fatigued. Of eating that does not demand attention afterward. Science does not say this grain is for everyone. It does not claim it cures or fixes. It only notes a pattern: when food changes faster than biology, the body often responds with confusion rather than acceptance. The older grain remains closer to what human digestion learned over thousands of seasons. Its proteins are less aggressive, its structure less insistent. It does not push the body to adapt quickly. It allows the body to proceed at its own pace. In laboratories, this appears as gentler breakdowns, fewer signals of stress, quieter responses. In kitchens, it appears as something even simpler: people finishing a meal and moving on with their day. Science, in this case, does not lead the story. It follows it, confirming softly what soil and seasons had already taught. Some bodies still recognize what modern systems forgot, not because they are fragile, but because they remember a slower agreement between food and time. The garden never forgot. While systems accelerated and fields grew uniform, the seed remained patient. It waited in small plots in mountain valleys in the hands of farmers who never fully let it go. It waited in memory, in the way older generations spoke of bread not as a product, but as something earned through time. Soil remembers what grows well within its limits. Seeds remember the pace they were shaped by. And the human body, even after years of adjustment, still responds when something familiar returns. This is not a call to go backward. It is an invitation to notice, to remember that some things were never meant to be rushed, scaled, or perfected. When we choose food that moves at a human pace, we are not rejecting modern life. We are restoring a balance that once existed quietly, without explanation. If this story stirred a memory of a garden, a kitchen, or a loaf shared at a family table, you may want to leave that memory here, where others can recognize it too. And if it brings to mind someone younger, someone who has never known food that waited for them, you already know who to share this with. Ancestral Soil is not about reclaiming the past. It is about tending what was never lost, and listening for what the soil and the body still remember.